So thank you. I'm going to talk about the birds chapter of the East Bay Stewardship Network Eco Health Assessment. I'm Erin Conlisk from Point Blue, and this is work I did with Matt Ryder and Tom Gardali. So we used eBird data to analyze trends in 28 species associated with 4 vegetation types: riparian, grasslands, oak woodlands, and shrublands. Your first question might be, well, what is eBird data? And for those of you who already know, I would like to tell you a little more about eBird data so I can talk about the ways and the approach we took to minimize bias in this data set. Then I want to show you some of the results of what the data tell us about birds in the East Bay Stewardship Network and give some recommendations for future study or for future eco-health assessments. So eBird data is community science data curated by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Anyone can contribute to the data set, that is anyone with an account. What I'm showing in this map are submissions on October 21st of this year, almost 9,000 by 7 a.m., mostly concentrated in North America and Europe, but global in scope. Each observation that is retained in the data set includes when the observation took place, where the observation took place, who performed the observation, how far the person or team traveled, how long the observers observed, the species and number of individuals seen, and suspicious data, so a bird that really shouldn't be in the reported location or shouldn't be in that reported location at that time of year, those types of sightings are removed from the data set. And even despite this expert curation, the data set is still biased. One source of bias is there's no standard protocol. So in this picture, everybody has binoculars, but the guy in white. And we might expect that there would be differences in the reported number of birds between folks with binoculars and folks without. They may also look for different amounts of time. Some may actually travel further. So lots of different sources of variability in this data set. There's also no standardization across states. So it could be, we probably expect that there's more observations on weekend days than weekdays. And this might matter if, you're trying to have a consistent assessment year after year of a target species, which is the goal of this analysis. There's probably one of the bigger issues is there's no standardization across locations. So we expect that birders typically go to really good places to bird, and that those places may be changing through time, and there's and year after year. So consider this fictional example in the context of a trend analysis. Let's say we wanted to know if there was more numbers of individuals or a higher likelihood of observing a particular species in 2020 versus 2010. And I have this little fictional habitat quality, darker green colors being higher habitat quality. And you can see that my example is consistent with that. The species is present 100% of the time in the highest quality areas. Outside that, you can see potentially that the species is absent in a greater frequency, but especially in 2020, where we have this suspicious line of data suggesting that there might be, say, a road where that bird watchers are using to access, recreational sites. So we might expect that, along a road, there are going to be fewer observations where the species is present, as in my example, and that comparing 2010 to 2020, 2020 is going to have lower numbers of sites where the bird was observed, but that has to do with where the data was collected, not the underlying population. This is even more exaggerated if you were to compare spring data to winter data. So here I'm coloring black now the winter points, and let's say this is a migratory bird that simply isn't there in winter. That would be a very obvious problem with this analysis. So in our real analysis, we mitigated these potential biases or their influences on the data or on the analysis by trimming the data to daylight and breeding season. So we looked at data from April 1st to July 15th. And standard practice is typically to assign a grid to the landscape and then average bird counts in the same grid cell on the same day. So for example, and this was, I found this frequently in the data set, you can have school groups going out observing birds. And this is 30 people submit the list of birds they saw, otherwise known as a checklist. But those aren't actually independent observations, right? It's 30 people recording the same birds in the same place. So you're going to want to average across them within a grid cell. Okay. Another potential source of bias is where the observations took place. So we spent a lot of time looking into this, and I want to show some of what we did using song sparrow as an example. So first we looked at the larger focal areas in the east, areas surrounding the agency boundaries here in dark on the landscape in the Bay Area. So we looked at these the larger landscape and the coloring within this region is from the Conservation Land Network and their vegetation type analyses. So you can see, different fractions of, say, scrub and shrublands down here in the south compared to in the north, where there's more oak woodlands and grasslands. You also see that compared to 2010, there's a lot more observations in 2020, and they're largely occurring in the East Bay Hills, potentially more in developed areas. So let's look at that issue of potential of developed areas. Are they increasing in the data set across time? So here I'm showing 2010. You can see that there's almost 20 observations occurring in developed areas. So basically what we did was we took a point and we extracted the cover type associated with that point. And then we compared it to 2020. And then the availability of that cover type across the entire focal area. So you can see that, in fact, as we expected, just looking at the map, there were a lot more observations in developed areas in 2020, and that it's very much overrepresented compared to the actual number of developed area locations on the map. So that's a problem. So we said, well, maybe we should restrict. There were more observations than we expected, so maybe we should restrict what we our analysis to the East Bay Stewardship Network agency boundaries. And when we did that, in fact, it did do what we hoped it would do. There's greater similarity between 2010 and 2020 in where, in the number of observations that occurred in developed areas, although they are slightly overrepresented compared to the vegetation types and the fraction of areas that were developed within the agency boundaries. So we actually removed all the developed areas, but we were much happier looking at these histograms to see that by and large, what was sampled in eBird points is representative of the type of vegetation that was within the agency boundaries, with the potential exception of grasslands that are undersampled. And we'll talk about that in the end as well. So with all of these modifications or filters really to prevent the influence of biased data, we considered two trends that were meant to sort of represent the extremes of what we could look at. So we looked at presence absence data for all the available data in each year. So that means we didn't control for the fact that in 2010, different places were observations occurred in different places than in 2020. We just took all the data. And we know that that can mean that there will be a few locations that were there were lots of birds, and they'll potentially have a big influence on abundance. So to control for that, we converted this to presence absence data. So the bird is either not there, 0, or it's there, 1. So that's what we did using all the data. Then we looked at locations where there was an observation year after year. There were about 57 points changing slightly bird to bird species to bird species. So these are points where we had an observation year after year after year from 2010 to 2020. And for these species, we looked at abundance. So we had 2 trend analyses per species. So again, I'm going to use song sparrow as an example. Here's the fraction of sites where the song sparrow is present. So in 2010, so this is on the y-axis. So in 2010, about 55% of observations recorded the song sparrow is present. And that bounced around to 2020. But there's no significant increase or decrease. Now, I'm just going to walk you through some other elements of this figure because I'm going to show you multiple figures like this. And then also, this is going to be in the appendix to the chapter if you want to sort of study these figures more in depth. So you can see that the point size has changed, and this is meant to represent the number of observations that were available, fewer than 100 in 2010 and almost 300 in 2020. We have error bars. Now, error bars, and there's a very specific formula for calculating error bars for proportion data. That's what we used here, and it's divided by the number. So the formula includes this division by the square root of the number of observations. You can see the error bars are getting smaller through time, consistent with more data. All right, that's what I just said there. And then the point of the error bars is that even when you see a difference in means across years, right? So in 2013, there were almost 60% of sites saw songbirds compared to less than 50% in 2012. So that mean difference may not be significant if there were just those 2 points because the error bars overlap. Overall, for song sparrow, there was no trend in presence absence data. Now we can look at abundance data. We see that the error bars are much larger for abundance data. And again, they're meant to represent the differences across points within a year. And even though the error bars are really large, we see an almost monotonic decline in the abundance of song sparrows within a grid cell. So overall, there is a declining trend for abundance for song sparrow. So we can take these two one more thing. We combine these 2 trends to define a species condition. Now I'm going to show you all the riparian species. I started with song sparrow. I've got that here. I now have an arrow. If it's sideways, that means there's no significant trend. If it's down, it means there's a significant decline. And if the arrow faces up, it means there's a significant increase. Declines are presented in red. So here I'm showing the 9 species in the riparian group. And I'm showing both presence, absence on the left and abundance on the right. And you can see that there's no other, song sparrow was the only species that had a declining trend. And then I hope that what you're doing right now as you look over these is seeing that the sort of the trajectory of the line, right? If it's bouncing around, but it doesn't seem to be going up or going down, you should see a side arrow associated with it. And then anywhere you see an up arrow, you see when you look at it, yeah, that I can see that there's an upward trend in the points in that figure. So hopefully as you do that, that's what you see. When we roll together all these 9 species, we get this overall riparian trend is stable. So there's 1 declining species and 8 stable, either stable or improving species. That gives us, we decided that we should call that condition caution, right? Even 1 species, there's potentially some risk that vegetation type, that ecosystem is at risk. And we have fairly high confidence in this particular vegetation type because there was good sampling of the data of the vegetation type. And for most of the species, there was a good amount of data. The exceptions potentially being the belted kingfisher. You can see that very fewer than 20% of observations recorded belted kingfisher, and same with yellow warbler. So we can convert these graphs, which were in the appendix of the chapter, to a table, which you see here. And you can see, right, so low confidence, but now we've got blue being the best, yellow being the worst typically across. So we've got improving, some species which are improving, the song sparrow, which is declining, its caution is good, but the other species, sorry, its condition is good, but the other, one more time, the song sparrow's condition is caution, and the other species conditions are good. And then we can look across the other vegetation types. Overall, woodlands are doing well, very few yellow boxes. Overall, shrubland birds are doing very well, although we don't have super high confidence because only 3 species were sampled. Grassland birds, there is cause for concern. So we had 4 species that had some evidence of decline. The only reason why, for the species, it's possible that the reason why we didn't see a decline for northern harrier and loggerhead shrike was we just didn't have a whole lot of data. So all of this points to potential problems for grassland birds. The only thing that mitigates that statement is that we didn't have a lot of data from grassland areas, right? We saw that with our histograms. So when I think about recommendations for the future, they are to collect more data in grasslands and outside the East Bay Hills. It would be great to compare any of the species analyzed here to a species that was monitored outside of the eBird data set to see if those two match. It would just lend confidence to the fact that we have in fact mitigated the variability across the eBird data. Consider dividing up the data by subregion, so you could compare developed areas to undeveloped, Mount Hamilton area if there were more data there, to the East Bay Hills, etc. And especially if you had a site with a disturbance, you could see whether eBird was capable of, whether the bird species associated with that disturbance might be sensitive to that disturbance. You saw differences in their eBird trends. It would be great to perform a power analysis. So we were guided in part by work of a former colleague who found that a 10-year trend could be detected 95% of the time if there was a 50% decrease, but that's a huge decrease. So, and that was data that's very different from these data. It would be great to compare monitoring of these common species to at-risk species, because this analysis is predicated on the idea that the common species can represent the at-risk species. More data across more years is always great. And finally, we based our condition on trend. So some sort of separate analysis, it could be sort of an estimate of the carrying capacity. So the maximum number of individuals that might could potentially use the East Bay. That might be another sort of separate metric for a future analysis. And with that, I would like to thank you.